Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the Beyond Fulfillment Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Goulis, and this week, my guest is the founder and principal of Bareither Consulting Group and the author of the new book, Improve Less, Chad Bareither. Welcome, Chad.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on. And just for future, it's Bareither. That's all right.
Pardon me, Bareither.
Yeah,
Okay. But yeah, thanks so much for taking the time. And if you could, can you just tell us what Bareither Consulting Group is and how it came to be?
absolutely. So, my background is anchored in process improvement or continuous improvement, operational excellence. Depending upon where you've learned that in your career, it might have a different name or a different flavor. So it's really applying some tried and true methods, things like industrial engineering, Lean and Six Sigma. And I've seen the way that's been able to fundamentally transform the way a business performs. What I've also seen is that it's not just on the surface, like something that we add on top of the way that we're running the business currently. It requires a transformation of the way that we manage the business. So the way we develop strategy, the way that we systematically improve processes, and the way that we manage our daily operations. And so now I've used that 20 years of experience of working in industry for some large organizations. And now I'm supporting organizations that want to start that transition, or that transformation has fallen off the rails and they need some help or some coaching to get back on track.
Okay. And so looking at your background, you've got a mechanical engineering degree, Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, and you got your start working with the U.S. Army. Is that right?
Yeah, so my first job out of school, so mechanical engineering is kind of funny. I studied mechanical engineering, thought that's what I wanted to do, had a summer internship and says, I'm pretty sure this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I did go back to school and do industrial engineering, which was a perfect segue into things like quality and quality management and ultimately Lean and Six Sigma. And so that was my first job with the U.S. Army. I was a civilian status, so I was not active duty or uniform duty. Much appreciation for any of those listeners out there that have served active duty for our military. Thank you for your service. I was in a civilian capacity, so I was a federal employee working for the U.S. Army on weapon system development. And most of the product line that I was supporting was in life. So it was already fielded device, and we were managing the production contracts there. And so I got a lot of great experience going to different manufacturing facilities, seeing different operations, and really trying to promote process improvement or process stabilization through quality means versus just inspecting the product on the back end.
Okay. And working so early in your career with the Army, what are some things that you learned with their systems and their processes that you can apply to other businesses?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the systems and processes enable an organization of that size to operate, right? Admittedly, so as any organization gets bigger, you're going to run into challenges of bureaucracy, if that's what you want to label it. But having systems and processes and standards, it's what enables an organization the size of the U.S. Army to operate in one consistent method. And so early on in my career, I took over as the custodian of one of our standards. So it's MIL standard, which is short for military standard. So MIL standard 1916, which was our preferred methods for acceptance of product. And so was able to use that to teach and train and then coach alongside on the actual production floor some of our suppliers on this is the standard that the U.S. Army wants to move, not just internally, but also the industrial base towards, of more process-based quality management, statistical process control versus sampling inspection. And then, you zoom that out, and we had standards and processes around things like source selection and competitive bids, even internal to the post where I was stationed, right? There's internal standards about how the post operates. And really, if you take that thinking out of that large of an organization, any organization to scale, to operate at a next level of capacity, you need a system of organized processes to deliver a consistent product, service, whatever it is your organization delivers.
Okay. And then from there, you went on to work with a couple Fortune 500 companies. Is that right?
Yep. So I worked in the medical device industry for several years, both on the what we would call the business unit side. So these would be more shared service roles, uh, R&D, quality, HR, finance, those type of shared service roles, and then also some of that time directly supporting operations. And that organization was going through an inflection point in their growth where they were centralizing a lot of the manufacturing. So there was a little bit of shoulder shrug on, well, what is our system? What is the common lean system that we were going to use for manufacturing globally? So I was fortunate enough to be part of a team that was defining that and then able to roll that out to 5 of our plants across the US. I had responsibility for central and western US manufacturing sites. Oh, and
Okay.
then following that was a stint in a little different application, was utilities, so electric and natural gas distribution. What's interesting is the concepts remain very much the same in terms of standard work and identification of waste or abnormalities, and trying to design that out to make it easier for the operator to perform their job, which translates into lower cost for the business to operate. So pretty unique that I've, in my corporate career, I'd say we're in very different industries, but was able to hone and see how you can take the same concepts and apply it kind of regardless of what the subject matter is.
Okay. And do you see that with a lot of smaller companies as a hindrance to their ability to scale is not systemizing processes early enough?
Yeah, I mean the early enough is a good question about like when's the right time. So, I'm a little biased, so I'd say now, but it is it is a requirement to scale. So I just had lunch with a colleague yesterday, and part of what he does in his business is helps people penetrate European markets. So I'm a US based manufacturer or equipment provider, and I'd like to sell in Europe. I don't know how to do that. And so he helps do that. Well, if you're going to acquire a site or license your technology or something, like you need like how are you going to tell someone in a different culture like how to produce the same quality product that you're making here? Like you need systems, you need processes, you need standards behind that. And there may be people listening to your podcasts that are just like nodding their heads of like, yeah, that's right. But do we invest the time? And I recognize this is probably the challenge of why we don't invest that time early enough, because there's only so many hours in the day. And I get that, right? I work shoulder to shoulder with some of these small to medium-sized business owners or business leaders. And I recognize there are daily things that are occupying their time in terms of firefighting and troubleshooting. But by putting systems and standards and processes in place around kind of your key functions, not everything at once, right? So it can be overwhelming to say like do everything. I'm working with one client right now to say like, here's a list of all the processes, like where do we start? Great, we'll prioritize, we'll go one at a time, kind of based upon what's the biggest opportunity. So that would be revenue generating, if you will, or where's the biggest pain point? Like where are we losing cost, market share, quality, things of that nature. So when's the right time to invest? Now. It's going to enable you to either just get some of your time back in your daily operations, or if you do have plans to scale or acquire or distribute outside of your region or your country, like you need that in place to make it easier.
It's a great segue into your book, and appreciate you sending me a copy. I went through it a little bit. So it's called Improve Less. And I love the quote at the beginning where it's from William of Ockham, and with all things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the right one. Can you just talk more about that quote and that concept and how it ties into your book?
Yeah. So this is largely like my philosophy on life is like, well, let's try to simplify the situation, right? And not everything is just an A or a B, but I get it. Every business is unique in terms of their internal culture, their capabilities, the market they're supporting. I understand that. I'm working with an R&D client where, every product development is unique, and I get that. But there should still be some underlying structure behind how we do our work. And so like, if we just try to simplify and say all things being equal, like what should happen? I would rather manage like the minority of variation than try to manage a custom execution of my process every single time I deliver. So let's simplify our processes, let's simplify our thinking, and just say, if we step back from it, can we even start by oversimplifying and start with that level of process? And so I did the very same thing with the book, as saying 20 years of experience. I've got some of the smaller text back here on my bookshelf, wherever that is. There we go. Right. But there's books 400, 500, 800 pages on the topics of like continuous improvement, industrial engineering, and saying like, if we just simplify it, I tried to give the readers in this something a mid-market leader could read in a weekend and like start that work on Monday. Like, let's just start simple. There's foundational things that need to be put in place before we worry about sophisticated tools and time study analysis and other things like that. We need an infrastructure and a system that's going to support layering the rest of that on. So let's start simple. Let's start with less.
Attention manufacturers and e-commerce sellers. Is fulfillment a headache for you? Whether you're fulfilling in-house and you know you need to outsource, or you're with another 3PL, you know you deserve better service, Easy DC 3PL can help. We offer personal service, fast response time, and we're flexible to meet your unique needs. Get in touch today and find out how we can help you. And it sounds so simple, right? Like it's, but we find, I'm sure you find, being out in the field with clients, right? It's often, there's so much complexity and maybe unnecessary complexity that causes these problems that the businesses are having. Why do you think that is?
Well, some of the unnecessary complexities is where there is the perception that I agree with the philosophy that the customer is always right. But like, your product, your service better than the customer. So bending over backwards and disrupting your internal business process creates complexity that you have to manage, so that the client's kind of, it's opaque to the client of whether or not you're doing anything differently. So sometimes we create complexity because we don't have processes, standards, et cetera. Can we meet that due date? Yeah, we'll meet that due date. And then we figure out how to do it internally. Meanwhile, internally, we're doing backflips and everything else to get the product or the service out the door on time, which is met by a high five, a wipe of the brow, and then we do it again. The other thing I want to tie in is, so that's like day-to-day delivery. Then there's new technologies, there's cultural engagements, there is process improvement, which is really the area that I thrive in. And we were talking right before we started recording that there's a lot of folks talking about employee burnout. There's a lot of folks talking about like, I don't have time. And so when we layer on a bunch of other initiatives on what's already an unstable foundation of the daily work, like, it becomes unmanageable. So my argument is like, well, let's start with fewer things. This becomes one of the hardest things for leadership to do, but a very important role of leadership, but a very hard thing to do, I admit, is really focusing down and saying, pick a priority. It is easy for leadership to hedge their bets and say, let's do everything. Right. But it's not easy for the next layer of management, right, or your frontline employees to say, let's do everything. Right. That becomes unmanageable. And then suddenly you have this middle layer of your organization that's just bombarded by initiatives on top of doing the work. I think we can simplify it and do a better job executing process change management, in an introduction of new technology, if we just focus on fewer things. But that's hard to do. That's leadership's job, the hard work of leadership, to really say, where do I want to invest right now?
And you work primarily with mid-market companies, is that right?
Primarily, when I work with larger companies, the Bareither group concept is that I have a network of resources in different industries that I can pull, doing the same work I do, for specializing in different industries and different capacities, that I bring in on larger engagements. So you'd get the same level of service. It's just, for me, the reason I target mid-market is like, I can individually service that client and be a force for change. So once you get over a certain number, I'll say in the range 200 to 300 people, right? Because in a sense, to make continuous improvement sustain, we're asking people to do their work differently. And I want to be clear on the way I said that, is like not asking them to do something else. We don't do our daily work and then continuous improvement is this bolt on of extra activities that we should be doing. We're fundamentally asking to change the way we operate the business. So don't just layer on standards, like stop the way you were doing it before. Let's align and standardize that. That's both from the tactical work as well as the monitoring and reporting work. And I can individually influence that level, or have one of my resources individually influence an organization that size. Once we start to get over that, still feasible. It just takes more resource to influence change with that many people. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're looking at companies with 200 to 300 people or so, what are some of the most common issues you see in terms of where they need to change the way they do their work?
It's a good question. The most common issues. Now, I'm trying to think how you would boil this down into one common issue. So if I circle all the way back, it's just a lack of either definition or adherence to process. So I might even argue worse than not having a process is having a defined process and not, is enforced the right word? Not following it, right? But leadership's job, again, whichever layer of leadership, is to ensure that the frontline value creation, so whether that's, your fabricators, your assemblers, your service delivery, that frontline of leadership is there to ensure that we understand the standard that is developed, because we put standards in place to make sure it's done the safest way, the highest quality way, and the most efficient way, but in that order, right? We shouldn't be sacrificing safety to do it faster. We shouldn't be sacrificing quality to do it faster. So we establish standards, and it's a responsibility of leadership to enforce those. So one of the challenges I see, and the reason that improvement doesn't sustain, which is the big focus of my book. So how do you make this last longer than 2 years, longer than one leadership change, is by actually implementing standards that you have time to enforce. So why roll out standard processes, procedures, 5S, workplace organization, if you're familiar with terms like that, if you're not going to enforce it, right? If you're not going to coach people to understand why it's important. And so I think that's the biggest general challenge, which is what I'm trying to address with the book, is like you do too much and then it's not sustained. And so then you have two things working against you. One, you've wasted some of that time because it's not sustained. The other thing is you promote in your organization this, like, what is it called? There's a term for it: normalization of deviance, right? Which is just saying it's okay to not follow the process. So let me just exaggerate for a point. If I have something like 5S and I'm supposed to put my tools back in a certain location, and management comes by and they're not in that location, they don't ask me why. Well, what other standards are not important to follow? Right? You create this situation. And it's like, so why did we even put that standard out there? We should have put it out there to solve a problem that resulted in better performance. So now if we don't care about the standard, like, you can't complain about the performance. So the very generalized problem I would see is you try to change too much at one time without effectively sustaining that in the organization.
So it's like, just like any new habit, right? You need to take time to let it sink in and become a habit, right? And follow the daily actions. And like you said, if the management's not going to make sure that the rules are being followed, then, right, what's important, what's not, who knows?
Yeah. So you haven't established that habit. So it hasn't actually changed the behavior. And you may have had a short change in results, right? But now if you want that sustained improvement of results, you're really trying to change the behavior, right? We're trying to adhere to standard. We're trying to follow process. We're trying to identify quality issues, not cover them up, right? And if you can't accomplish that, like, that's a problem. It's even more wasteful to have spent the time to put that out and then not sustain it. Absolutely.
Okay. And I just want to circle back to like the beginning of your company. So what you had this corporate career, you're working with some large companies. What made you decide to go out on your own?
So in the back of my head, I was always like, that would be great. I just get a charge out of working with different people. And if you've ever heard of like Gallup Strength Finder, like in the Gallup Strength, like my number one is learner. So I'm naturally a learner. I'm always trying to learn something. Maybe it makes me a little bit fickle in my hobbies, but professionally, I always got a charge out of that. Going to a new facility, working with different people, solving a different problem. So in the back of my head, I was like, oh, like consulting would be pretty cool, later, like when the kids are out of the house or something like that. While I was in my last corporate engagement, it was like a friend of a friend asked if I could help with something, basically in the same vein of like, we need your help, we need your consultation, not their exact words. So I incorporated a LLC so I could actually invoice them and get paid. And then from that one engagement, it kind of from word of mouth, I started mentioning to people I do this on the side, and it grew and it grew. And then over the course of 2 years, it grew to enough where I was standing there saying, I don't have enough time to work a corporate career and support the client base I've built. So great problem to have. Just happened faster than I expected. Also a great problem to have. And so that's how I got to what I'm doing now. And now I'm just really passionate about working with those organizations and saying, I have seen the change I've been able to deliver for clients. I want to have that not only the transformation of the results, but also that learning experience. Like there's nothing that charges me up more than kind of, that like aha moment when you see like someone gets it and they think about their business differently and they know what they need to do to change. Like that is really what I do it for.
Wow. Okay. So it almost, right? It almost kind of by accident, right? Where people were asking you to help and then enough people asked you and there you go. You have a consulting business.
Yeah. I wish I could say it was more intentional. It was intentional. The speed was faster than I intended. So,
Okay. And speaking of employee burnout too, something else we see with consultants, right? Managing all these different clients, customers, different businesses, whatnot. I mean, that's a common thing in terms of being, managing or dealing with burnout there. How have you been able to manage the growth working with, the client base and your time and making sure everyone can get the results they need from you?
yeah. So, I mean, I take a dose of my own medicine, right? So I use the same strategy deployment process that I coach my clients through internally, right? So I do that with myself, and I set annual goals and I set quarterly goals that I'm working towards. So it can be very clear what I should be working on, what I should not be wasting my time on, right? You can get stuck in time suck holes of accounting or website update and stuff like that. And it's like, so I need to be very focused about where I'm spending my time. And does that have a link back to what I'm trying to do with the company? And then in terms of client delivery, it's back to having processes and systems. So I learned this pretty early on. Let me actually get back to that point through a little detour here that's essentially how the book came about. Was as I was scaling and about to go out on my own, I realized like I can't just custom deliver for every single client. So I said, what is my process? If I started from zero, what is the process I would take a client through? And I came up with this 5-step, focus and align framework, which is tailorable within the client, but we still go through those same 5 phases to get to a sustainable system. And I do the same thing internally. So I know when I'm going to deliver for a client. So this has shortened time for like writing a proposal, for like, what do I look for in terms of metrics to identify the value capture that particular client's going to have. When first engagement, workshop design, like that's all standard now. So I can actually scale. I can bring partners in on a bigger consulting engagement because practicing what I preach is like I have systems and standards in place.
Wow. Okay. And yeah, how, because we see even with entrepreneurs too, right? That's one common thing I hear a lot of is managing time and managing priorities. And you may have a plan and then, something happens and it can go off the rails. So uh, any tips for other entrepreneurs out there in terms of sticking to a system when unexpected, whether it's a customer issue or anything else comes up?
Yeah, so it's really interesting the way you phrase that kind of put me back on my heels, sticking to a system. Because in one regard, your standards should change over time, right? As you figure out a better way to do something, you should update the process or the system that you're using. I will say though, a common thing, if you, regardless of, so a business coach that I've worked with, regardless of who you work with in terms of a coach or an advisor on either building or scaling your entrepreneurial endeavor, one of the first things I'll talk about is getting rid of, non-value, non-revenue driving activities. So some of those things I already mentioned, right? Like bookkeeping and email contacts and follow-ups. And through the use of something like a virtual assistant, right? Or a full-time assistant. But if you just pause, how easy would it be to onboard help if you said, this is the process I follow. These are the expected results. I'm going to walk you through it now. What questions do I have? Versus like a lot of times there's the hesitation of bringing on help because it's going to take me too long to train them. Or in some cases, it's really just an excuse because I don't really know what I do. I just get it done and I don't have a schedule or time blocking or anything else to get it done. So that would be my advice, is start thinking about putting systems around your value adding work, but also what systems would you put around your non-value added work, your back office work that you can either automate. So, I mean, there's a lot of workflow automations that can take advantage of that if you have your process defined. Or if you're going to bring on part-time help through a virtual assistant, fantastic. If you have systems and processes, there's your work instructions. You can onboard someone a lot faster.
Okay. So with the book, this came out, I think, end of last year. Is that right?
Yeah, October 2023.
Okay. So what's that been like for you promoting the book? I mean, I see you're on Amazon, you're sending out copies. What's that whole process been like?
Oh, it's fun. So the process up to launching the book was like interesting, right? So I going from words on a page to a published manuscript, that was like just a black box to me. So again, making use of my time, I hired someone who knew how to do that, right? So it was like I worked with a publishing strategist and he helped me go from draft, I won't even say rough draft because I had been through some revisions with peers, right? But from draft to listed on Amazon. And so that's another thing, just thinking in terms of entrepreneurs. If there's people out there that already know how to do what you're learning, like, I mean, how much is your time worth? Like, pay someone, as silly as that might sound, but hire a coach, like hire a consultant. Like, if someone has already figured this out, it can cut your learning curve in half, and then you're back to delivering value. Now, on the end of like, so once released, I have found by putting my work, let me just say generally that by the whole writing process really forces you to crystallize your thoughts. So when we have interviews like this now, it's like, I mean, I've already spent time thinking a lot about what I want to say on these matters. So my engagement with the client is easier. Speaking engagements, whether podcasts or live events, becomes easier. So promoting the book has been fun because I get to talk about it. It's also been fun. Again, I mentioned I'm a learner by nature, to hear what people don't like or disagree with, because maybe there'll be a second edition at some point in the future with, I've improved my process since then. So it's been great to talk about. It's been largely well received. And so if anyone wants to go out and get a copy, it is on Amazon, as you mentioned. You can contact me directly, and there's links through my website as well. But yeah, I'm having a blast with it.
All right. And so we're early on, still Q1 in 2024. What are you most excited about with your business this upcoming year?
So I do have a couple of prospects that I'm pretty excited about doing some work with, that are either like just a company that I've wanted to work with, or in one case, like an industry I haven't delved into yet. So like I mentioned, again, learner is like, man, just applying these in a different context, improving my game while delivering results for the client is really what I'm excited about.
Okay. And if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about what you do, what's the best way they can do that?
So I'm most active on the LinkedIn platform. So if we got show notes for this, you can link it out there. But it's my name. You can just look up Chad Bareither on LinkedIn. Also, our website is bareithergroup.com. And so you can find all my direct contact information right there if you have any questions. That's really the two best ways to get a hold of me.
All right. We'll link those in the notes. And Chad, thank you so much for being here and taking the time. And that's all the time we have for now. We'll see you next time.
See you.